Hello everyone, welcome back to my Form 3 religion class at St. Anselm's Abbey School. In this video, we're going to take a look at the divine attribute of simplicity, which St. Thomas Aquinas talks about in question 3 of the Summa, the very first of the divine attributes that he discusses in his natural theology. Now before we do that, I want to look at all of the divine attributes that Aquinas talks about, in part because this will be a good table of contents for future videos, and also to give you a feel for the kinds of things that he wants to derive. In question 2 of the Summa, he's gone over the 5 ways to demonstrate the existence of God. And when you're done with those, when you have your conclusions, and especially we're going to focus on the first way, because that's the one that I teach my students every year, you have some basic notion of a first thing that is pure act. And most of the natural theology in the Summa is a question of what else can we know about it? Are there consequences to something being pure act? What else can we prove must be true of it? And this right here is the table of contents for what Aquinas thinks he can prove about pure act or about God. The first set on the left there, simple, good, infinite, omnipresent, immutable, eternal, and one, those are, generally speaking, the easy ones. They're very closely related to each other, and they're very closely related to the 5 ways. They're almost just direct outgrowths of something that's already been said in one of the 5 ways. And there's a lot of overlap in the ways that Aquinas proves them. You could generally think of these as the easy set, the first tier of attributes. You wouldn't necessarily find that every medieval philosopher argues for them in the same way or in the same order. You could, for example, start with infinite and move on from there, take that as your starting point, and prove all the others in terms of infinite. But Aquinas pretty famously starts with simplicity, which certainly to us as modern readers seems like a very strange starting point, but very important if you want to understand the complete tradition of Catholic philosophy and theology. Now, after you've done the easy set, then there's a very difficult set. I would call it the ambitious attributes. Can we really prove these? This is a much, much further reach than the first set. Generally speaking, in Greek philosophy, we would never bother trying to prove all these things. The Greeks wouldn't necessarily think that these things apply to God. But Aquinas thinks he can also demonstrate that God is intelligent, living, loving, provident, that he cares about the universe. Very interesting if you can prove that by reason alone. Arguably something that you can only know by revelation. But Aquinas takes his best shot at it. Certainly you could find natural theologians or philosophers of religion that would deny that you could prove those. So that's a more controversial set. And then at the end, Aquinas comes back around to 2 pretty easy ones because they are directly related to things in the first set. And there's just really an order of presentation issue going on here. It is worth noting that omnipotence, which we would very often take to be one of the first, if not the first things that you would want to say about God, is last, or basically last for Aquinas. And also this question about divine beatitude. That's a little bit of a surprising one, but as it turns out, extremely important, especially for ethics, which my juniors are grappling with right now. In this video, what we care about is simplicity, the first one. What do we mean when we say that God is simple? And to get into that, we're going to have to define some terms a little bit. The word simple has a correlative term, complex. And we mean these words in a couple of different ways, but the primary signification of them has to do with parts. A complex thing is, relatively speaking, made of more parts. And a simple thing is, again, relatively speaking, made of fewer parts. So you could say that A is simpler than B because it's made of fewer parts. Or the reverse, that B is more complex than A, or more complicated than A because it is made of more parts, like a stapler being simpler than a computer. Once you get down to all of the parts involved in a computer, it's an enormous number of parts. With a stapler, it's 30 or 40 bent pieces of metal, basically. Now, there is a second signification to complex and simple, especially in English at least, and that is we often mean when something is complicated or complex, we mean it's harder. And when something is simple, we very often mean it's easy. And I think it's not too difficult to see why we do that on the basis of the first signification. When something is made of more parts, or there are more steps to the process, there are more things to understand. There are more connections to understand or make. There's more to do. So there is a very reasonable way in which difficulty does increase as complexity increases, or certain kinds of difficulty. And similarly, when there's only a few steps, that seems easier to do, or easier to make, or easier to understand. But it is important to see that there's no necessary connection between the two. Something can be simple and very difficult because it's simple, because there's not much to explain. You either get it or you don't. You either do it or you don't do it. It's hard to explain it or give a method for it. It requires something more like intuition. And similarly, if the thing of many steps or parts is just many easy things to do one after another, it may not be that difficult. A famous example that I like to give in my class, an argument in philosophy could be much easier to understand if it has more steps, if it has more parts, because you're making everything clearer. If you have a short argument of just a few steps, but each one is very, very arcane and hard to understand, the simple argument, because it's simple because it has fewer parts, is the more difficult argument. At any rate, what Aquinas wants to talk about is not God being relatively simple. He doesn't just want to say that God is the simplest thing. He wants to say that God is omnino simplex, altogether simple, entirely simple, or as we would say in a more modern parlance, absolutely simple. He's not composed of parts at all. And his main objection to this, Aquinas' own objection, is, well, nothing in the universe is like that. Everything in the universe is composed of parts in some way. So how can this work for God? And that's what we're going to look at a little bit in these next articles. How is that going to work? Well, we first have to get clear on different kinds of parts. When we're trying to analyze the way parts and wholes work, and the philosophy of parts and wholes, we actually have a fancy name for it, fancy sounding, mereology. It's just the Greek word for the study of parts. You could make that partology if you wanted to. It means the same thing. And in mereology, what we want to understand are basically the rules, the logic of how parts and wholes work. Right? And Aquinas gives 6 articles where he looks at 6 different kinds of parts. You can call these, or as I call them at least, the Aristotelian toolkit. These are all different ways that Aristotle analyzes things, substances, objects, the objects of experience. How do we analyze them in terms of parts and wholes? There's more than one way to do that. Quantitative parts, matter and form, nature and individual, essence, existence, genus, difference, substance, accidents. We're not going to look closely at all of them. I'm only going to introduce a few of them. They're all important at some stage in the program at St. Anselm's. We will use matter and form this year, and you'll also use it in future years. We will definitely use nature and individual when we come to talk about the Trinity and the Incarnation. They're very important there, but not a very easy one to try to explain right now on top of everything else. So we're actually going to skip that one in this video. Essence and existence we've already looked at a little bit. That showed up in Proslogion 2. We'll say some more about that one. That is, in some sense, the overarching one, the big one. Genus and difference will be useful to us this year as well when we're talking about what it means to be human. Substance and accidents, very important in the future, but we're not going to look at it in this video. It's a bridge too far in terms of number of things to cover in a video. There's only so much punishment I want to deal out at once. So we're going to look at a few of these and the different logics of part and whole. And then when we're done, we're going to come back and talk about why none of these can actually apply to God. So the first article that Aquinas tackles is quantitative parts. Fancy sounding, but it's actually just what most people mean by when they say parts. I used the example of the stapler on the previous slide. Let's think about a bicycle, right? A bicycle has many parts. It has a frame, it has wheels and tires, there's a post and a saddle and a fork and a stem and handlebars, and we can go on and on and on. We just keep naming them, right? We might even call them intuitive parts, what most people mean when they say parts. You can disassemble them, you can put them together, and when you pull them apart, if I take the chain off of my bike, I have one part of the bike in one hand and I can have another part of the bike in another. Quantitative parts are a set of things with dimension and extension, very much in the matter in the way we mean it in a physical science class. Things with volume that mass and take up space and things like that. Quantitative parts are also what feature very prominently in the Ship of Theseus thought experiment. Some of you perhaps know about that one. Very famous, 2,500-ish year old thought experiment about this kind of composition and what's happening when you slowly over time swap out all of the quantitative parts of a thing. What's the continuity through time of this substance as you're changing out all of its parts, so that eventually none of the parts that it has now were there when the ship first sailed. This is still the same ship. We're not going to get into the Ship of Theseus, but if you know a little bit about it, then this is the quantitative parts idea. Stuff that you assemble in a very mechanical sense or in a spatiotemporal sense into a whole. The other kinds of parts we sort of group together as being very different. Quantitative parts, you've got an object in one hand and an object in the other, and you put them together. For all the other pairs that we're about to look at, that's not true. So sometimes they're called, in modern language, in modern terminology, sometimes we call them metaphysical parts, although there's probably no need to make it more complicated than it needs to be. For Aquinas, they're just parts, just another way of talking about parts. Matter and form are parts, or maybe principles, of a substance. You can analyze anything as in terms of what it's made out of, the from which or the out of which of a substance, and its form, the shape that matter takes, or the shape that is introduced into that matter, the arrangement of the matter. Very importantly, that shape or arrangement or order is not a thing that you can hold in your hand. You can hold a block of rubber in your hand or marble, but the form is not matter. It's the shape that stuff is going to take. The form is only touchable, in a sense, in the substance, right, when the thing is made. So one of Aristotle's very famous examples is making a marble statue. You have a substance, marble statue of Jupiter, or whatever. Its matter is marble. That's the from which or the out of which. And the artist introduces a form to it, a shape, the shape of Jupiter. It's a fanciful one. It's an imaginative one. The example I use, I think slightly simpler, is rubber and the form sphericity. I don't mean a sphere. I mean the geometric shape of sphericity, this idealized thing. When you combine rubber and sphericity, you get a bouncy ball. Now, we can make the examples much more complicated than this. There's a lot more to say about form and matter. We're going to, for example, say a lot about this when we want to talk about living things and what's the form of a living thing, because their form is in some way dynamic. Aristotle very famously talks about living things in terms of matter and form. We will see that later in this year. But the general account here is that you have matter which is formed, informed. It is the thing that experiences the change. So matter and form turn out to be another way to explain change, just like actimpotency. And that turns out to be a major hint about why matter and form can't apply to God, if you've understood the first way correctly. Aristotle also uses this mode of analysis to explain how we learn. When we're learning things and when we're sensing things, any kind of apprehension of objects and thinking about them involves abstracting the form of the thing with our minds or with our senses. But those are things we will come back to in the future. We don't need to know too much about that right now. But this is another kind of composition. You can say that anything is composed of matter and form. That's what it's made from and the shape that stuff's been given. In Article 4, Aquinas looks at essence and existence. And we've already talked about this a little bit in my Form 3 class, because it's a useful pair of terms for discussing Anselm's argument in Proslogion 2. Essence for Aquinas means what a thing is. He often associates it with nature or with the definition of a thing. We also have a fun Latin word, quiddity, or whatness, as another way of talking about this. Existence, on the other hand, is that a thing is. And there's a lot of famous ways to try to articulate this in Thomistic philosophy, especially. Existence, or esse, it's the infinitive, the Latin infinitive esse. For Aquinas, it's the act of all acts from which all other action flows. This is closely related to one of the topics we skipped, nature and individual. It's one of the reasons I skipped it. A lot of what we say there is also said here, so we don't need to do an overlap in this video. But it's existence that actualizes essence. Things are real by virtue of the act of existence. I've given you some examples down there at the bottom left of things, of essences that have no corresponding existence. They don't exist. A thing that doesn't exist yet, like an unwritten novel, a novel that exists in my mind, but I haven't actually written and published yet. This is similar to Anselm's example in Proslogion 2 of the painter knowing what he's going to paint. That's a thing that has essence but no existence. Dragons, fictional things, although I'm sort of ambivalent about just how fictional dragons are, but that's a personal hang-up. We don't need to worry about that one. You could put a fictional thing of your choice in there. Or a Tyrannosaurus rex, a thing that doesn't exist anymore, an extinct species, for example. Those are all examples of things where we know what the thing is. We can talk meaningfully about what it is, but it doesn't exist. And so essence and existence are in some way separable for things. They are two different parts. A third mode that we want to look at is genus and difference. You would probably be inclined to say genus and species. And I want to say a little bit about this now because it proves useful terminology for things that we will do over the next several years in our program here. The words genus and species both mean kind of thing. They mean kind. In fact, that entire biological classification system that you learn as students in school, kingdom, phylum, subphylum, and whatever all the others are, class and order and family and all the rest, they are all synonyms. They all mean kind of thing. We've just arranged them sort of artificially into a hierarchy of broadest category of kind, broadest kind, subkind, kinds of things. So when you talk about something being, a genus and a species, you're talking about kinds of things within a broader kind. In Aquinas, those terms are relative. He's sometimes very flexible about which one he means. So when you're reading through him, it's not quite interchangeable willy-nilly, sentence to sentence, but article to article it is. It's probably worth noting that it is where we get the words general and generic. It means pertaining to the genus, and special and specific do come from species. And occasionally those adjectival forms, it's worth knowing that we should use them technically. Maybe not always, but Aquinas certainly will. We don't have to worry too much about the fixed biological classification system, but it's probably worth knowing that it directly grows out of this kind of account given by Aquinas historically. How does it work for composition, though? I mean, essentially, he's claiming that genus and difference are parts of a species. So just like we could take matter and form and get the substance, or you could take essence and existence and get the thing, the res, we can take genus and add a specific difference, and that'll give us a species. The most famous example in all of Aristotle is to take the genus animal, living thing with a certain set of powers, and that's a genus. There's lots of kinds of animals. Then you add a specific difference, rationality, and that's a difference that specifies. That's what we mean by specific difference. It's the difference that creates a species. There's an animal that has the power of reasoning, which marks it out from the other animals that don't have the power of reasoning, and that's what Aristotle means by a human. We will come back and talk about this at length when we talk about human nature, so we don't need to argue right now about what's going on with other animals and what we mean by rationality. We'll cover that at length later. It's just the easiest example to give here to express what we mean by a genus and a specific difference. You want to argue about humans and dolphins later, we can do that. Now, the big thing for Aquinas is that none of these modes of composition can apply to God. None of them. And it's not too hard to see why. My students have read, as the reading for this assignment, question 3, article 7, where Aquinas gives his overall reasons for why. In each of the other articles, 1 through 6, he does give a reason within each article why this kind of composition doesn't apply to God. But the overarching one is what I've given here on the right. The simplest way to say it is this. Every mode of composition, every kind of part-whole relationship that can ever exist, necessarily implies potency. There is a potency involved somehow. But God is pure act. Therefore, no mode of composition can apply to him. The conclusion of the first way, whether you want to call it God or not, whatever name you want to give it, the conclusion of the first way is a first thing that is pure act. And pure act cannot involve potencies. And every kind of composition implies potency. Therefore, God cannot be composed of parts in any way, which means he's absolutely simple, not relatively simple, absolutely simple. It's related to the claim that I've already made in class with my students, that God can't change. If change is the reduction of potency to act, God's pure act and doesn't have any potencies, and he can't change. Simple conclusion. And all of these are similar. You can line up the composition pairs and either very strictly or at least roughly make them correspond with the act-potency distinction. Act is to potency as existence is to essence, as form is to matter, as difference is to genus. In some way, the things on the left-hand side are actualizing the things on the right-hand side. They either really are actualizing or there's some kind of actualization going on. In the ones that I've omitted, it's a little bit more of a complicated discussion. But something in every form of composition is being actualized. One part is actualizing another part, like form is what's actualizing matter in some way. Or some prior thing is actualizing. So to go back to the very first one, quantitative parts, as parts, they require something before them to put them together into a whole somehow. And, well, we've already shown God is first, and he's pure act. So none of this can apply to him. That's not just an empty conclusion. There's actually a lot to say about that. There's many, many consequences to saying that God is simple. And I just want to sketch a couple of them here. One of Aquinas' most famous formulas for God is that his essence and his existence are the same. His existence just is his essence. Unlike everything else in the universe, where they're different, God somehow, part of his essence is that he exists, or there is no meaningful way to distinguish them. One of his most famous little mini formulas or names for God is ipsum esse subsistens, which is a little bit of a tricky mystical term to get into, but in some way God is just existence itself, subsisting as a thing. Not the active existence of all things. That's where it starts to get tricky. That somehow he is just existence itself as a subsistent thing. Very strange. Very difficult to wrap your head around the first time you hear it. And again, totally unlike the things of the universe. Right? We're concluding from observing things that are composite, things that are changing. We're concluding to the necessary existence of something that is not composite, that is not changing, where it just is existence somehow. Perhaps more important than trying to emphasize that God is pure existence, you can also try to negate the right-hand side, right? Like in some way we want to say that God is not material because there's no potency. So we're going to deny whatever's on that right-hand side under the potency column. God's not material. There's no from which, there's no out of which. That is a way to say that he doesn't change, but it's also a way to say that he doesn't begin, I think. Yeah? He's not material. Pretty provocatively, it seems to suggest that he's pure form. And Aquinas does talk about this, but it also brings us right to the door of a very famous medieval controversy that Aquinas very much is drawn up into. And we're not going to talk about that in this class. It's pretty cool. If you want to talk about it offline, you can drop a comment below, or you can reach me outside of class, but we won't be wasting any time with that in class. It is cool, though. We're going to deny that God is a member of any genus. It's not so much that we want to say God is pure difference. That's a little weird. It'd be interesting to try to pursue that. But he's not a kind of thing. God is not even a member of a class where he's the only thing in it, right? A unique member of a class. We deny explicitly and emphatically that God is a kind of thing. That might be the simplest way to say that he's not like anything. Like things are some way in a genus. You can't be like God in some important way, very important way. And this last one, which is actually the first one that Aquinas looks at, that God doesn't have quantitative parts. Somehow there's an act of assembly involved in quantitative parts. That can't apply to God. For Aquinas, this means God is not bodily. This is what Aquinas means by body, Aristotle. A thing having extension, dimension. God is We've already said immaterial. It seems like this one for us, for our way of thinking about things, the second one and the fourth ones on this little chart overlap a lot. He's not bodily, he's not material. When we say that God's invisible or can't be seen, we don't mean it like he's got a cool superpower. We don't mean he's invisible because he's got a neat cloak or because he's bending light. We mean he's not the kind of thing that can be seen at all. The bundle here, the package, and we could definitely say more, but the package here of pure act, unchanging, necessarily existing, immaterial, not bodily, not a kind of thing. When you bundle all of that, you get this claim at the bottom. You can say it in many different ways. God transcends all of our experience of the universe. Nothing is like him. So you're not going to be able to locate him. You're not going to be able to wander around and eventually find him. He's so far beyond the way we think about the universe and the way the things of the universe exist. This is why we say we cannot know what God is, only what God is not. The doctrine of divine simplicity gives us that formula that I've already taught my students in class. Our intellect requires things that we can break down. There's no similarity between this ipsum esse subsistens, pure act, and my bicycle, or the stars, or even gravity. It's just not like those things. So he defies our modes of thought and is, by definition, necessarily beyond them. So as long as we're talking about human reason unaided on its own, we can't know what God is. We can only know what God is not. We can only get there by negation. And that's what all of these have been. All of these claims in divine simplicity are just negations of potency in some way. God also defies our modes of expression. Right? Everything about our intellects and our language is proportioned to the things of the universe, to objects that are composite and that change. And so it's even when you know this and are trying very hard to be careful, by definition, whatever you think about God will fall short, and whatever you say about God will fall short of the reality. That's just the way it is. He stands far, far beyond our experience. Not just the experience that we have now. It's not that we haven't explored enough. It's the fundamental limitation of what created things can know about this thing, which is not created. It has no beginning. It has no end. The end of a thing is the dissolution of composition. He isn't that. He's not composed, so he can't dissolve. And if you can get this idea of the significance of pure act and simplicity, then a lot of the things that we're going to go on to say, both in natural theology and in revealed theology, once we start talking about God coming down from heaven and telling us things, they will make a lot more sense. Some of them become a lot more difficult. Right? Suddenly we have big questions about how we read the Bible and what we're going to say about Jesus as a guy who walked around on earth and changed and was one of us. There's lots of problems that this raises, but you have to have this natural theology first to appreciate all of the things that we're going to say in the rest of the tradition. Okay, that's more than enough for this video. We're going to stop it here. If you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of me. Happy to help clarify things down below or in email, Discord server. You know what to do. And otherwise, good luck with your studying and God bless.